Listen, I am a messenger from the future. I am you in 10 years. Pay attention. Don't fetishize marriage and babies. Don't succumb to the axial tilt of monogamy. I don't pretend to know the details of your situation, but I guarantee you, you're as free as you'll ever be. Have sex with anyone you want. Enjoy the fact that it might happen any minute. You could have sex with a man, a woman, both, tonight. You could have sex with someone 20 years older than you. You could have sex with someone from the other side of the planet. Better yet, be alone. Enjoy your body. Come every day. Worship at the altar of the divine goddess. Travel. Travel everywhere, especially short distances. Travel around your kitchen. Travel up some stairs and down again. Pick up and go. Enjoy all the holidays you won't get anymore. New Year's Eve, Halloween. Go to the lake. Go camping. Go on a boat. Go to Vegas for all I care. Even shitty St. Patrick's Day in Vegas is better than the best day at home with an infant. That was an excerpt from I Love You But I've Chosen Darkness by Claire Vaye Watkins. I Love You But I've Chosen Darkness was published in 2021. The inception of the novel began after Watkins had a baby, and in her postpartum boredom was ranting about needing to do something important, and said to a friend, "I need to go shoot an elephant." The friend replied, "Dude, you're a mother. You've had a child. You're struggling to make your marriage work, man. You are trying against your nature and circumstance to be decent. That's your elephant." In true autofiction fashion, it's nearly impossible to fully pull the author out of their work. So before I begin to tell you about her novel, I'm going to tell you the briefest of things you need to know about its author. Claire Vaye Watkins was born in 1984 in the desert town of Bishop, California. She lived in California and Nevada, spending her entire childhood and formative years in the desert. In real life, she is divorced with a daughter. Both of these things are relevant to why I Love You But I've Chosen Darkness is autofiction. And yes, her father was Paul Watkins, a prominent member of the Manson family. Along with being a writer, Watkins is a professor. She's taught at UCI, Bennington College, Princeton, Bushnell University, and the University of Michigan. Her published works include a collection of short stories called Battleborn and 3 novels, Gold Fame Citrus, I Love You But I've Chosen Darkness, and Yellow Pine, which will be published in July of 2026. The typical setting of all of Watkins' work is the desert, as she has stated that growing up in the environment is what helped shape her into the artist and person she is today. In fact, due to the nature and setting of her writing, her work has been described as Nevada Gothic. Now let's talk about I Love You But I've Chosen Darkness. Claire Vaye Watkins is the lead character in this story. Though true to the genre, it's difficult to tell how much is her and how much is fiction. The story begins with Claire, her husband Theo, and their baby daughter. Claire is pondering when she can stop calling her depression postpartum and simply relabel it as depression. She sets off to Nevada as part of a tour for her latest novel, and while away, contemplates being a mother and leaving her marriage behind. Through the almost 300 pages of the novel, Claire examines how she arrived at this point in her life. She feels disconnected from her husband and child, and even the writer and woman she was before giving birth. She contemplates the lives and deaths of her parents, Paul and Martha, as well as her own relationships, namely with her husband Theo, her dead ex-boyfriend Jesse, and her current boyfriend Noah, whom she met on a leg of her book tour. Watkins, the author, and Claire, the protagonist, share a name and common background, making this novel an intricate puzzle of autofiction. Before I break down more of the novel, I want to discuss the autofiction of it all. In an interview, Watkins talked about the writing of I Love You But I've Chosen Darkness, and stated that she tried not to make herself the main character and had a different character with a different name, but slowly she came to the realization that the story only worked if her protagonist was Claire herself. This undoubtedly feeds into the opening lines of the novel. I've tried to tell you this story a bunch of times. This will be my last try. Claire, the character, is processing her own story, what makes her who she is, the same way Watkins undoubtedly did as she wrote it. And like the real-life Watkins, the character Claire is a writer and professor. Her story is complicated and filled with generational trauma. And in Claire's case, this trauma comes directly from her parents, Paul and Martha. One of the things to consider in autofiction seems to be, when is the writing or author talking about itself? On page 28, Watkins writes, Paul did not tell Crockett or anyone what he'd heard from Clem. If he told it, he would have to hear it again. He would have to know it and live it. What Paul is referring to here is the infamous Manson murders. He wasn't present at the crimes, but he heard the stories firsthand. He didn't want to relive them, going so far as to leave the family. On the next page, he changes his mind and returns to the Mansons, and Claire writes that Paul wanted to extricate some meaning from all the horror and carnage, to step back into the nightmare and find something worth salvaging. It feels to me as though these two moments of Paul's story are relating directly back to Claire's own, an expansion on the meaning behind her opening lines. I've tried to tell this story a bunch of times. This will be my last try. To tell a story is to try to impart meaning or a message on your audience. And with I love you, but I've chosen darkness, Claire is trying to tell her own story in a way to extract meaning for herself and others. Watkins is writing about her family, her parents, her friends, and her own life, even if she is stirring fiction into it. On page 48, she reminds the audience, you must remember that this was real. As the story goes on, Watkins writes, I drank, I smoked, I spectated. I sculpted reality as I moved through it. The only people I liked were the ones who gave me something for the page, yet I never wrote. Is Watkins describing Claire's destructive spiral or her own? We know that Watkins did in fact write, as I'm talking about words she wrote in her book, but what is the distinction between author and character? Later, when Claire is recalling her dead ex-boyfriend Jesse, she begins to talk about the trajectory of her life since him and things she never expected. She talks about places she's been around the world and name drops writers she's met, from one of the Game of Thrones bros to Ira Glass, and then says, sorry, there are only so many people I can talk to about these things. Is that voice Claire, the character, or our author speaking to the reader? Either way, it's a version of breaking the fourth wall that wouldn't be typical in a standard fiction novel, but it reminds us that we are reading the words of a writer, which feels very much like autofiction. There are many elements that make this novel a work of autofiction, but the final one I want to bring up is the character of Noah. Noah is a man Claire met on a leg of her book tour and started seeing. He is the man she decides to go away with instead of returning to her husband and child at the end of her book appearance. A significant portion of the novel is devoted to their escapades in his van, finding a place to live in the Pacific Northwest, and Claire coming back into herself as a sexual being after childbirth. Their eventual breakup is what sends Claire back to Las Vegas to find her sister and revisit their childhood home before she dissolves her marriage. Noah is significant. However, on page 283, near the end of the novel, Claire returns to a friend of she and Noah's and learns of Noah's engagement. Watkins writes, I didn't believe it and didn't need to. I had by then my own belief system, one that needed very little of actual Noah, whoever he was. It occurred to me that I was barely asking about Noah. Maybe I didn't know a Noah. Maybe I made him up. My Noah lived in Joshua Tree, pollinating Joshua trees with a 5-bristled paintbrush. My Noah lived up in the last sequoia. He would never love another, and the sequoia would never die. Is Noah real? The story contains Claire, versions of her parents, her sisters, her husband and daughter. So is Noah a real relationship? Or was this branch of the story, the Noah branch, a narrative device Watkins invented to get her fictional self from point A to point B? When you read the novel, I hope you come to your own conclusion, as I couldn't find one in my research. But as a writer, I'm inclined to believe that Noah was an invention of the narrative. Now that we've gone through who Claire Vaye Watkins is and some of the autofiction elements of the novel, we can talk about how the story of the novel is told. I Love You, But I've Chosen Darkness is not told in a fully linear fashion. There are sections to the story. The main chunk of the narrative is Claire's. The novel begins and ends with Claire. The thrust of the novel is her story. However, parts of the narrative also belong to her father, Paul, and mother, Martha. Martha is a constant figure in Claire's own story. Though she's dead in Claire's present, tales of her childhood and adolescence are filled with Martha and how her drug addiction and life choices framed and shaped life for Claire and her sisters. In addition to this, another element of autofiction, the book contains real passages from Martha's own letters that she wrote as a teenager. These letters are spread throughout the book, and like any teenage girl, the passages are primarily concerned with her teenage loves. Also given narrative power is Claire's father, Paul. Paul's story begins around the time of his recruitment into the Manson family and goes until his early death at the age of 40, but the bulk of his narrative is framed around his time with the Mansons. This is likely because, as Claire states in the novel, Paul Watkins died when she was 6, so the majority of what she knows about her father is memories and remembrances from his sharing of his story with the public. As I will discuss more in a moment, Claire's story frames the entire narrative of the book. We learn of her childhood, her marriage, and the onset of her becoming a mother, all the way to the dissolution of her marriage. The narrative is concerned with Claire parsing out her life and figuring out how her past affects her present. Just as Martha's sections in the story discuss her many relationships with men, Claire's narrative unfolds much the same. Her story as an adult is sectioned around her husband Theo, her dead ex-boyfriend Jesse, and her boyfriend Noah. While Jesse is not a character given storytelling power in the novel, he is clearly important to the shape of the novel and who Claire is. Not only is her story with him a section of the narrative, and he's brought up multiple times throughout the book, but the book's title itself comes from one of Jesse's tattoos. Like the message Jesse's tattoo conveys, there's a repeating cycle in the novel, one of the choices people make and the darkness that results from it. Martha left her family for Paul, then after his death, metaphorically left her own children because of her issues with addiction, and finally died, addicted to the opioids that were supposed to be healing her. Paul first left the Manson family, only to return to them after he betrayed them, and was subsequently left by the remaining members of the Mansons. Later, when he has his own family, he leaves them early due to his terminal cancer, dying before his children's ages are even in the double digits. For Claire's portion of the cycle, she first leaves her family to go on tour, then decides to leave her marriage for Noah, before finally being left by Noah. Even though Martha's story takes up more narrative space than Paul's, which isn't surprising as he died far earlier in Claire's life than Martha did, I do wonder if Claire started her novel with his story because the shape of his narrative most closely resembles the shape of her own. Paul betrayed his family, the Mansons, before going and finding a family of his own, a positive future gleaned from a dark past. For the majority of the narrative, even as Claire is making decisions that will affect her life and family, she is worried that leaving her marriage is a betrayal, and in the end she comes out of her darkness and depression, finding a new hope and future. As the only living member of the narrative trio, Claire's story doesn't have as finite an ending as her parents'. What's important to how these stories weave together, their purpose, is in the final lines of the book as Claire talks about her daughter. I tell her about the now and the big gnar, about everybody doing the best they can with what they have, choosing darkness, choosing light. When she asks about you, I tell her the truth. You were here, then you were gone. You died the way this river dies, not so far from where it was born, turned into sky. Jesse Ray, my dead ex-boyfriend, my son, my stepson, my sister, Mom, Martha Claire. I have a daughter now. She knows your name. This brings us to the themes and motifs present in I Love You But I've Chosen Darkness. The most present themes in the book all appear in forms of trauma for Claire, motherhood and identity. On page 200, as Claire is speaking to Noah after she's run off with him, she says, I tell him I am ready for the now, need it, have always been here, that all else is dust, that death is a friend of mine, that according to the latest research, I have all mother's pain in me, and her mother's, and him too, that we came from their spines, and. This selection is just one of many moments in the book where Claire places an emphasis on motherhood. Through the book, she's concerned about how as a mother she'll affect her daughter, how her own mother has changed and affected her, how the onset of motherhood has changed her as a person. To Claire, motherhood is a cycle that is passed from woman to woman, and it's not always a positive. This can be seen when she's telling her mother's story, as she reminds us, I know she did not always love being a mother. She loved her garden and smoking and work. Claire sees motherhood for what it took away from her mother and might be robbing from her. The message the book tries to impart on the reader is that family leaves an indelible mark on each of us. When Claire has her baby, she first seems to realize this in her depressed state as she discovers she's growing teeth in her vagina. Watkins writes, naturally, at first I felt myself a mutant. I was afraid and disgusted. But most vaginal dermoid cysts are benign, I read. They come from DNA the baby leaves in you. I admit I did not entirely grasp the science, but rather than hate or fear the tooth, I resolved simply to monitor it. Through her depression, Claire is recognizing that her baby changed her at a fundamental level. This is a constant refrain in the book, even if you look back to the opening excerpt I read from. Claire is discovering what motherhood has done to her and how she needs to respond to it. When Claire first gets to Nevada and visits friends, she starts to see how fully motherhood has changed her when she encounters her friend Ivy, who is now the mother of multiple children, including an infant. As Claire sits next to Ivy in her living room, surrounded by Ivy's family, she recognizes she and I loved but no longer understood each other. Motherhood had wrenched us into separate spheres. She, the attachment parent, me, the detached mother. As Claire pushes deeper into her book tour and herself, she finally admits, motherhood had cracked me in half. Claire's struggling with motherhood and what it's done to who she is as a human, why she can't write, how she doesn't feel like the same person she was before having her child. She sees a split in her identity and tells us early on when thinking about her book, I didn't feel like the person who wrote it. This plays directly into another of the main themes in the book, identity. The theme of identity is carried predominantly through Claire's journey, but is reinforced by several other characters in the book. As Martha is a major player in the narrative, I need to bring up her letters. In her letters, she's clearly trying to discover who she is, usually through the relationships that she's engaging in. During one of her letters, she mentions having just finished reading Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, before mentioning a boyfriend gave her a book on the stories. Alice says, there's hardly enough of me to make one respectable person. This is after she drinks from the bottle and shrinks. Harry's book says about this, and the question is thus raised, how can a person be so numbered as one person? Is he just one person only when he is very small? Martha is already thinking about who she is, not knowing her daughter is going to do the same. In a more humorous take on identity, Claire is handed her friend Rust's driver's license and told he's wearing a mask of his face in the photo. She doesn't understand what she's being told until she stares at the license photo. I could see it now, barely. A rubbery quality about his jowls, a slight matte swell at the cheekbones. It looked more like him than him. Claire thinks her friend is undergoing some kind of long-term performance art. To her, Rust is playing a part, and the mask on his license supports her feeling, but she can't figure out what's real and what's performance. As the major motif of the book is what happens when you become a parent, we need to remember that Claire was also someone's child, and a child and an adult have vastly different ways of seeing the same people, especially their own parents. At one point, Claire recounts a conversation she had with her mother when Martha attempted suicide. Claire told her, well, you're not going to join him, I said. I mean, if you kill yourself, you're going to hell, right? Then I'll see him there, she said. You think Dad's in hell? She laughed. Sweetheart, he was Charles Manson's #1 procurer of young girls. For Claire, who is Paul Watkins? Her father or a member of the Manson family? Is he both to her or neither? Claire's story is told through her past and present and how she sees her relationships with people who have left this life before her. Paul, Martha, and Jesse, all 3 people that did not live or die peacefully and painlessly. Through the book, Watkins seems to want the reader to feel the same things about Claire's journey as she does, that there were ghosts and omens all around, and we needed all the interpretive help we could get. In the end of the story, Claire leaves her marriage and returns to the desert that helped raise her. She realizes she is a new person shaped by her past. And I will leave you with one of Claire's thoughts near the end of the narrative, when she's making her realizations about herself as she and her sister revisit their childhood home. You and I have loved each other and her, and been loved by each other and by her, them, in all these houses, through all these memories which were once moments, real and felt, even if forgotten. We have loved and been loved, despite the fissures and losses, violence, cruelty, smallness, deficits in money and time and attention, despite betrayals and indifferences, the distance and weather, despite developing different definitions of certain words. Catching my breath, I said, I think I'm gonna stay here.